Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This afternoon we are fortunate again to have a very special guest from the United States, a guest who will be participating at the Solutions Conference that will be held on the 24th of February, Saturday the 24th of February in Sydney, in Darling Harbour. We have with us Professor Conchita Sarnoff. Professor Conchita Sarnoff has done tremendous research in the area of human trafficking, a very important area where, according to some statistics, there are as many as 27 million people around the world who have been trafficked, and according to some labour organisations, there are as many as 21 million people in forced labour. Professor Conchita, can you hear me?
Yes, good evening.
Yeah, it's afternoon in Australia. Good evening and good afternoon, and welcome to the program. You are on Voice of Islam Radio. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join your program.
Professor, in the introduction I mentioned that some research shows as many as 27 million people trafficked. Now, this type of research doesn't capture the full picture always, but I'm just I find the figures to be mind-boggling in this day and age, in the 21st century, when we talk so much about human rights and there's so many charities and human rights organisations. In your research, you'd have come across many figures, I suppose. How do you feel about this particular figure? Is it accurate? And if you can give us an idea from which countries people are trafficked.
Yes, certainly. First of all, let me begin by saying that all figures are estimates, and I'd like to call them guess estimates because, unfortunately, neither the United States or, I believe, any other country has a data bank in place that could give the accurate figures, meaning the first line of defense is always the local law enforcement. In order for a trafficked victim, be that victim, i.e. child, trafficked for organs, for sex, or for labor, that victim has to come into the police department, identify himself or herself, and then explain to the police, the local police, that they were trafficked. Now, many victims are not aware that they are being trafficked, and many police officials have not been trained and or educated to understand the difference between prostitution, for example, and child sex trafficking. So the numbers are at best soft and at best conservative.
I take it from that, exactly as you say, that they are very conservative, just like many other crimes that go unreported. The figure could well be many, many multiples. Just for the benefit of some of our listeners who haven't come across the term trafficking before, if you, Professor, would kindly give an idea what the term itself means.
Sure, certainly. In order for a child victim or an adult, female or male, to be trafficked, it does not, first of all, it does not necessarily include transportation, meaning the transport of a person for sex, labor, or organs. That person can be taken from one place to another place in the same city, in the same state, and not cross state lines, and that person will be considered legally a trafficked person. There is, however, across borders, transnational criminal organizations that traffic children for all sorts of reasons, sex, labor, organs, across national boundaries. So the definition is the coercion of mostly a child, many times an adult female and or male, and the enforcement of them having to do something to give a type of service for free. So sex, of course, is one criminal activity. Labor is another criminal activity. organ trafficking is clearly another criminal activity, and what is happening in parts of Africa where boys are being trafficked to become child soldiers. That is also a form of human trafficking.
So, in your experience, Professor, from which countries do many of the traffic victims hail?
Well, from all countries. This is a crime that has absolutely no prejudices whatsoever. Children and adults are trafficked regardless of nationality, regardless of socioeconomic background, and regardless of religion, and, of course, creed and race. So there are children from every single corner of the planet that are being trafficked today.
So you've mentioned, Professor, that some of them are used in the sex industry, and some are used as child soldiers, and some in forced labour. And you mentioned some for organs. What this really means for the listeners, just to elaborate, is that their organs are taken out of their bodies and transplanted into another person's body who may need that particular organ. And of course, in all cases, this would be done against the will of these people, whether they're men, women, and children. When these people are trafficked, what type of living conditions are they usually kept in?
Well, they are deplorable. I mean, anybody who is taken via force, fraud, or coercion, which are the three forms of trafficking, force, fraud, and coercion, and forced to give an organ, as you can imagine, certainly is going to be taken to an unsanitary place, because in order for any person to give an organ legally, they must either sign a consent form, they must be hospitalized, it's done under sterile conditions with medical doctors, whereas these children, mostly children, who are trafficked for organs, are taken into dingy hotel rooms, dirty, halfway houses where their organs are removed, of course unwillingly. They are drugged, heavily drugged, and then their organs removed. And these organs are then sold on the black market. And of course, the younger the child, and I'm not an expert, sir, in organ trafficking. That has not been an area of expertise for me. But from what I have read, these children, the younger, of course, the organ, the better, because it's more healthy. So this is a black market criminal activity that the pharmaceutical industries are well aware of. And as I'm sure you know, organs are very expensive. Transplants are very expensive. So perhaps moving forward, what we should do as a society, what we should do as a civilization, is to try to focus on the criminal networks that are trafficking children for organs and create grassroots campaigns and awareness to have this heinous crime stopped.
Professor,
and maybe bring in the pharmaceuticals too, I'm sorry.
Yes, well, there's a lot that can be said about the big pharmaceuticals out there and the influence that they have. And I think there's a lot that can be done to put some controls to improve the operations of these pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that governments are doing enough to tackle this problem? Governments of countries that receive traffic victims and the governments of countries where people are, where there's a large occurrence of people being kidnapped or coerced or tricked into becoming traffic victims. Do you believe that these governments are doing enough, or is there anything that you would like to see them do?
Actually, I've had so many meetings with so many government officials that I can say that even the best of government officials, and there are many government officials that really do that have the best intentions and do want to see an end to trafficking, but regretfully, they do not have the resources, they do not have both the manpower and the tools to prosecute the traffickers. There is a model in which most human trafficking organizations, or at least the 14 federal agencies in the United States, work from this model, and it's called the 3P, as in Peter, the 3P pillars: prevention, protection, and prosecution. And even though there is now, this model has become questionable because perhaps it's an outdated model and there's not enough being done to either protect the victims, to prevent trafficking from happening, specifically to high-risk populations. And certainly the prosecutorial aspect of this issue is in a state of disarray in the United States and certainly across the world. So I believe that we have to work on redesigning the model in which countries can, A, collaborate, partner, and be able to stop specifically the transnational criminal networks that traffic humans across borders. And we have to work on that assiduously. And that has not happened yet.
Professor, perhaps some of the listeners aren't aware of the impact on families, but they can certainly imagine that the life expectancy of a traffic victim is reduced dramatically. If somebody is used for transporting organs, if their organs are taken out, they could die in the operation or could die from sanitary problems after the operation. But also those who are used in the sex industry, their life expectancy from some of the research I read is about 4 years once they get into that industry. Yes. And the impact on families, I know that last week, I think, there was a family that living not too far from the area where this studio is, where their 13-year-old daughter disappeared, and everybody's frantically looking for her and putting messages out, hoping that somebody will find her and find her safely. You must have dealt with many families, spoken to many families, perhaps interviewed many families who have lost a loved one suspected to be trafficked. Can you just give our listeners a brief insight into the impact on these families, please?
Yes. As a matter of fact, today I spoke to a family member of a child who was trafficked at a very early age. And the child, even though the child is now an older child, an adult, the impact on the family is eternal. It is long-lasting because families, specifically families who come from, let's just say, normal, average nucleus and have not dealt with this type of trauma before in their lives, they haven't dealt with abuse, it is catastrophic for both parents and for the siblings to see that how their child lives through and copes with the trauma. Trauma presents itself in many ways. Mental illness can be part of the post-traumatic disorder, as can drug abuse and prostitution at a later date. If the child was trafficked for sex very early on, sometimes these victims not only become drug users, heavy drug users, but they also become prostitutes themselves because they didn't know, they were never taught to do anything else but to sell their bodies forcefully. So the trauma on the family, the impact on the family emotionally, physically, spiritually is overwhelming and can destroy even the strongest and the most religious of families.
Professor, you're also an expert on child sex abuse. I'm sure that you've followed some of the reports on the Australian Royal Commission into the institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Now that the investigation has been finalised, understandably, there are many questions amongst Australians as to what will happen to the perpetrators, or whether there will be proper preventative measures to stop this happening in the future. I was just wondering if I could have if our listeners could have some of your insight on this point, and perhaps where you see Australia going forward.
Certainly. Well, I think one of the issues we need to differentiate is the profile of the trafficker versus the profile of the predator. A trafficker, a human trafficker, is, you can equate him or her to and I'm not meaning to offend anyone when I say this, but you can equate him to a salesman, someone who sells anything, be it fruit, be it an automobile, be it clothing. It's a salesman type of job. The reason they're selling humans versus material, physical things, is because there's more money, and the risk factor is lower, and the reward is higher. Drug trafficking and weapons trafficking, the risk-reward ratio is far higher, meaning much more dangerous to sell drugs and weapons than it is to sell a child. It is easier to traffic a child than it is to traffic an illegal weapon and an illegal substance. There's also more money because a child is re-trafficked 10 to 15 times per day, meaning that child is sold over and over 10 to 15 times to 10 to 15 clients per day.
That's horrific.
Until the child either dies or becomes so ill with diseases. And there's a wonderful Indian film that I just saw the other day called Sold, S-O-L-D, about a lovely Indian girl based on a true story. She was actually not Indian, forgive me. She was from Nepal. And she is sold by her father to a female trafficker. And then the trafficker takes her into India. And the story develops in India. And this child is sold 10 to 15 times. And it is what she sees in the brothel. Many of the girls who are brought into the brothel because they're either abducted or sold by their parents they die of AIDS, they die of numerous sexually transmitted diseases, and of course that is a major issue. So either the child becomes an addict, which is usually the case right away. And I remember I was speaking to a trafficker, I don't know, a month and a half ago. I was interviewing this trafficker, and I said to him, "How long does it take you to break a child?" And he said to me with a straight face, 2 weeks. It takes 2 weeks to break a child, meaning mentally. So you can imagine the damaging impact, the long-term damaging impact of this criminal activity.
So what do they do with the child if the child dies at their hand, or if the child develops or contracts?
No, they just discard it. If the child dies, they discard the child. They simply bury the child or throw it in a river or somewhere where people won't see the child decompose. I mean, this is truly a crime that we need society. We need the world. Everyone must come together. This is, as I said, the profile of the predator. And back to your question, because I deviated from answering your question. The profile of the predator is different than the profile of the trafficker. A trafficker is a salesperson. The predator is different. The pedophile has a mental illness. Usually, 90% of the time, the pedophile has been sexually abused as a child. Usually, on average, the pedophile is a person who has the mental capacity of a child, that relates to a child because he or her, and it is sadly mostly a he, not a her, does not feel threatened by a child, whereas pedophiles usually feel threatened by an adult, meaning having an intimate sexual relationship with another adult. So it is easier to control a child, clearly, than it is to control another adult. And so the profile, the rate of recidivism, the rate of recidivism of a pedophile is very, very high. A trafficker can, I believe, be rehabilitated much more easily than a pedophile.
Professor, I'm just being conscious of the fact that you told me that you've got other meetings.
Yes.
I'd love to continue for a lot longer. I just would like to cover a couple of more important points before you have to leave us for your meetings. Based on your research and based on the Australian Royal Commission, we found that the church itself was responsible for much of the abuse. And in that, amongst that findings, there was, as I understand, a recommendation for an inquiry into the mandatory celibacy to find a possible solution. Just wondering what you think about that and how you feel about that particular recommendation.
Thank you for the question. It's interesting. I'm not so sure that mandatory celibacy would do away with pedophilia within the clergy. Perhaps mandatory celibacy will help those clergy who have the need and who have been having intimate sexual relations with outsiders of the church. But I don't believe that mandatory celibacy will actually impact pedophilia, because the priests who have been accused of sexually abusing young boys or girls, it's not going to stop. That's not going to stop them. They have a mental illness. I don't think celibacy, being able to now have sexual relations, is going to change that. That's my view. But again, I am not a medical doctor, so I can't speak as a psychologist. I'm only speaking as a victim's advocate and as someone who's researched this issue for over a decade.
So, the Pope's stance on this issue and the stance of the Church globally, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that's going to help reduce the problem?
Forgive me. Can you repeat? Forgive me. I couldn't quite hear you. Could you repeat the question?
The stance of the Pope on the issue of child abuse. How do you feel about the stand that's being taken by the Pope on the issue of child abuse?
Well, it's quite conflicting. I think it's confusing, and I think his position has been somewhat conflicted. On the one hand, he seems, in some of the reports that I have read, I have never met this Pope, and I certainly have not spoken with him or any of his advisors concerning the current issue of pedophilia and sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. So, given the reports that I have read, I believe that the Pope perhaps might need to become more familiarized and perhaps less politicized about this issue, because it is a growing issue within the Church. It has damaged the reputation of the Catholic Church heavily. I know many parents who refuse to enroll their children in Catholic schools because of this very reason. And it puts the Church into question, the teachings of the Church into question. So I think the Pope needs to study this issue much more closely.
Well, you'd think coming from South America, where there's high incidence of disappearances of young people and all sorts of stories coming from the trickle of survivors, that he would have greater awareness of the issue. But as you say, he would need to perhaps study it a lot more and look at the human side of it, look at the personal stories of survivors. Professor, as I understand, some European countries are making moves to normalize pedophilia, and that will be a shock to many of our listeners, that modern European countries, again, where they champion human rights, are making this this very frightening move to normalize such a horrific act. Would you care to give us some more insight on these moves and what can be done?
Yes, absolutely. I actually agree with you. It is absolutely shocking that they have tried to define pedophilia as a sexual orientation. And that is the modern, contemporary definition, or at least the certain therapists across our world have attempted to define pedophilia as a sexual orientation. And clearly, by any standard, there should not be, that definition should not exist. It should not be allowed, should be illegal. And anybody who could make a claim that having sexual intercourse with a child, let's say age 5 or 10 or 12, when that person is 30 or 40 or 50, needs to have their head examined. So I know that in the country of Peru, for example, I believe 3 years ago, the age of consent was 16. And because of the growing number of government officials being accused of pedophilia and of sexually abusing minors, the government, instead of taking it upon themselves to help prevent and protect the victims, they too, the government of Peru, changed the age to consent and lowered it to 14, which I find criminal. So, there is a movement that is attempting to create support for the decriminalization of pedophilia. I don't know if that movement will, take hold.
Which countries, Professor? Can we name some of them?
Well, from what I know, the United States. Let's begin with the United States.
Yep.
There is a movement in the United States. There is a movement in France, from what I understand. There is a movement in Peru. There is a movement in a number of developing nations. In Mexico, I actually had a very disconcerting experience, and I don't wish to name names, but it was a female, and she was a director of a very important university, who, during the process of the interview, said to me that basically what was the difference between a 14-year-old having sex and, an 18-year-old. Well, clearly there is an enormous difference, because the mind, just, as a non-medical doctor, I know that the mind develops, every year the mind takes on, a different form of development. And so the experience that a 14-year-old has is processed differently than the experience that an 18-year-old has. Those activities are processed very differently. And so not everybody can actually be able to take on a sexual experience at the age of 14 or 10 or 8 or 5 and process it in the way that an adult could process the experience.
Well, particularly when these young people are victims of abuse and or trafficking, or it's being done to them against their will, or they're being exploited in one way or another, that will certainly leave long-term ramifications, and perhaps in many cases, maybe in most cases, they may never recover and be able to live a normal life again. Professor,
yes, that is right.
Professor, thank you very much for your time. I'm just being conscious that you wanted to give me only half an hour today, but for the listeners, you'll be able to meet Professor Conchita Sarnoff at the Solutions for a Better World conference. The details of this conference are at inforeset.com. The Sydney conference will be on Saturday the 24th of February from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. In Darling Harbour. The full details will be available on my Facebook and also at the inforeset.com website. Thank you very much, Professor, for being with us today, and we look forward to talking to you again. And please enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for having me on your show.
Thank you.